Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Welcome back to Horror Heals, where we dive into the shadows of fear to uncover its light. I'm Corey.
And I'm Kendall. Today, we're thrilled to bring you part 2 of our conversation with Mathias and Marc from Aarhus University's Recreational Fear Lab.
In part 1, we explored how horror impacts our mental health, why we're drawn to fear, and how haunted attractions have become a treasure trove of scientific research.
Now we're turning the spotlight onto how horror builds community, the psychology of the final person trope, and why the Recreational Fear Lab's work is reshaping how we think about fear and wellness.
If you've ever wondered what happens when academia meets haunted houses, or why horror conventions feel like family reunions, you're in the right place. Let's jump back in. And that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive with Mathias and Marc from the Recreational Fear Lab.
Mathias and Marc's work proves that fear isn't something to be avoided. It's a powerful tool for growth, resilience, and even joy.
I get the sense that what you're saying is that horror is somehow, it can be sort of community building. It can be for social bonding. That's also something that we hear a lot about. But I think we also hear about, that was puzzling to me the first time I heard about it, was that there seems to be, at least anecdotally, a lot of anecdotal reports of people that have anxiety issues that use horror to sort of treat their own anxiety, which was really paradoxical to me. We haven't conducted any systematic studies of this yet, but we are definitely going to do that. But I want to get your take on this. Is that also your experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We both, have issues with anxiety, and not so much social anxiety for Kendall, but for me a little bit. What I've found has really worked for me is I don't do the cosplay in the traditional sense of like, putting on zombie makeup and things like that. I find the loudest, flashiest, sparkliest suits I can find and try to find as many, matching accessories to go with it. So I look like,
or clashing accessories.
Or clashing, yes. Where I look like a bad attempt at a 1970s pimp.
Yeah.
And that is like how I get conversations started, because I don't have to walk up to people and say, hey, how are you doing? Do you like podcasts? Because they come up to me and say, oh, I love that blazer. I probably heard that 100 times last Friday night when I was at the convention, and I was there for 3 or 4 hours. So that's sort of like my icebreaker, at these events. And then that's all of a sudden the conversation has started, and I can just take it from there. But that's kind of my Linus's blanket from Peanuts, kind of my security blanket are my flashy suits.
And what about the movies themselves? Do you feel like do you also have this experience that they can help you deal with being in an anxious state and even get you out of it?
I think so. I think for me, it's an escape from reality. It takes your mind off of whatever stress is going on for an hour and a half or 2 hours to watch ghosts or vampires or zombies or whatever. That's one part of it. And then the flip side is that, most traditional horror movies have a hero type, and they're usually some kind of an outsider or a freak or, whatever. And, as gay men, we certainly relate to that. I think there's a lot of gay people who are finding that sort of comfort in horror movies because they also see themselves as not completely normal, like what people would traditionally say, oh, normal.
Or marginalized.
Right.
At least.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me that almost all these examples you give have to do with some kind of social signal somehow. Some of the things we have discussed previously have actually not sort of gotten around those perspectives. One of the hypotheses that we've been throwing around is that, perhaps, so anxiety is often like conceptualized as this fear that doesn't have an object, right? There's nothing in front of you to be scared of. You just sort of have this looming unpleasant sensation. But what fear does is that it gives you sort of a clear signals that you can relate to, and you can sort of engage in a cycle that ends at some point, right? Unlike anxiety. What would be your take on that kind of analysis?
So I'm trying to think of, I thought of an example, but I'm not sure it's a good one. So I said, and I have to be cognizant of my listeners who might also be my employees. They stress me out. You know what I mean? Like part of my job, much of my job is stressful. And it's funny. I think everyone, or maybe around the world, thinks that human resources people, all we're doing is planning parties. And that is so not the truth. In fact, that's the thing I like to do and I get to do the least. Well, after a really stressful day of dealing with sort of some bullshit at work, I love to come home and say, could we watch some people get killed? And that sounds awful, but to your point, there's a little sense of denouement at the end. And I'm like, all right, I can make it through another day, and that's a jokey way to say it, but I think it's a real deep seated feeling that I have. I feel like I am aware that the people that Jason is killing are not really being killed. And I think, but it's still so symbolic of stressors in your life, which again, also social, but really that's an internal mechanism for me as a human, as somebody that poor Corey doesn't want to have to listen to my stories that much more often. So it's great for us to turn on the television and I can direct my focus for a while upon somebody who, can't answer.
Yeah. And going back to the social thing real quick, that's one of the things that I really love about the horror conventions is that it's not necessarily just celebrating horror movies, but you've got all of these brilliant artists there that are working in any medium you can think of. There are composers and there are writers and of course the people dressed up, it's great to see somebody's original take on a classic horror character. It's just, that's why I say, and I think a lot of people say that the horror conventions are our happy place. And it's surprised me a little bit that, I've had so many conversations at these events and I love talking to the vendors and we're going to have this amazing artist on soon, but she's very anxious about it. She's never done a podcast before. She's pretty anxious about it. But I wouldn't have gotten that sense at all by having a conversation with her in person one-on-one. But I think it's because the vibe is so positive there. Everybody's so nice. It's hard to not have a smile on your face while you're there. Yeah. And I think then I think we have sort of like, it's like a letdown at the end of the weekend, because it's like, oh, the convention's over. We have that post-con malaise that a lot of people, talk about it in social media.
It's a funny thing if I can jump in. I haven't been to I've been to StokerCon, which is more of a sort of academic horror conference, and was mildly surprised at, how nice everybody was. And it brought to mind something. I have a close friend who's a cop in the capital of Denmark. It's called Copenhagen. So he's a cop in Copenhagen. And he told me once that they have these, huge music festivals. One of them is a heavy metal, death metal, Copenhagen, it's called. And he said that's when they have the least to do. Those people who go to those heavy metal concerts and they look like something out of a horror movie, with the leather clothes and the piercings and the hair and the devil signs that they throw around. They're not afraid of embracing the darkness and, rocking out to lyrics about, eating babies or whatever. They don't go around knocking down innocent people. Same maybe as, Stephen King once said that, one reason why he wrote horror stories was so that he didn't have to pay a therapist. He just lets all the dark stuff out on the page and people pay him.
That's right.
I can't even remember seeing security people at any of these horror conventions, and I've never seen an incident where somebody had to be, taken out of handcuffs or anything like that. Quite the opposite. If somebody trips and falls, it's going to be 5 of those heavy metal guys who are rushing over to help them get up back on their feet. And so it's just, I don't know, there's something magical and beautiful about the horror community that, why are we so nice to each other? I don't know. It's just, we've got this shared love of blood and guts and, Freddy Krueger.
I think if you did a sort of systematic analysis of the moral structure of horror movies or horror stories in general, you would find that they tend to be very kind of pro-social, very kind of promoting altruistic motives. The good guys are the ones who cooperate. like in Dracula, classic vampire story. Dracula himself is he's selfish. He wants dominance, He doesn't care about people or their feelings. But the good guys, they band together, they work together, they're self-sacrificing. And that's a general kind of underlying norm structure of a lot of horror stories is the good guys are the ones who collaborate and who self-sacrifice. The monsters are selfish, menaces to society. So despite what some critics might think, horror movies in general don't tend to kind of invite sympathetic identification with a killer. They tend to invite us to share the pain of the people being chased by Jason or Freddy or Michael Myers or whoever.
Auntie's made a nice segue over to my family from the family twist story.
Right. Yes, for sure.
Oh, God.
So there's this trope in horror movies called the final girl. Well, we call him the final person on this podcast. And I don't know if Mark will have an answer or not, but the question we have for all of our guests, our final question is, who is your favorite final person from a horror movie?
There's no wrong answer.
No.
It's a difficult.
So the last person left alive?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, they're the hero, heroine,
Yeah. They're the ones that are taken out.
and or just escaped, right?
Right. Yeah. True.
Yeah. Like I made it out of the town and everybody else is dead.
I mean, the horror movies that I've enjoyed the most are, and I haven't watched, I think, 1/10 of the horror movies that Mathias has. That would be remarkable if I had even done that. So you're talking to a horror noob here, but the horror movies that got me the most and that I, for some reason, saw the most of as well was the Saw movies. That kind of psychological horror of these horrific dilemmas that these poor people were put in, that really caused some intrusive reflections in the days to follow. But I can't, even when I try my hardest, remember if any of the people in those movies survive.
So you've repressed that memory.
And I haven't seen all of them, surprisingly, but I think it's kind of one of those situations where you think they've all died and they pop up in a sequel 2 years later.
True. Never quite clear, right?
Right.
That's funny.
Mathias, how about you?
Holy shit, that's a difficult question.
It is.
I don't know, that the obvious answer would be probably Laurie Strode from Halloween. That's sort of where the trope crystallizes, right? But also, one of our studies was tweeted about by Heather Langenkamp, which I thought was like a career peak. But I love the Scream movies, and I thought Neve Campbell's Final Girl was really kick-ass. And these are all female final girls, but they're the ones that spring to mind. I like the trope, it's a cool thing. Picking a favorite one,
Definitely named. I think all three of those have been named for sure.
For sure.
Nancy from A Nightmare on Elm Street and Jamie Lee Curtis, fantastic performer.
And I'm a huge Adrian King fan, so I love the Alice Hardy, who's the last one in the original Friday the 13th,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Neve Campbell is coming back for a Scream sequel that just announced 2026.
really?
It's,
I thought she was out for good.
Nope.
no, I did too.
They're never out for good.
No.
They're
They always
never-
come
they
back.
always come back. Please allow us to stay in touch with you. This has been great. As we said, we like to explore all aspects of horror and wellness and our mentalities. So we will definitely keep up with what's your studies. And if you think of anything, an interesting topic, please reach out. Take it on and have you back on the show.
For sure. Thanks for having
Cool.
Of
us.
course. We've loved exploring the science and community of horror with Mathias and Marc. If today's episode has you rethinking your relationship with fear, let us know on social media or drop us a review.
And don't forget, you can find more about Mathias and Marc's work at Aarhus University's Recreational Fear Lab. Links are in the show notes.
Thanks for tuning into Horror Heals, where we prove that fear is more than fun. It's good for you. Until next time, stay spooky, stay curious, and remember, when someone asks, is horror good for my mental wellness? You answer, of course it is. The Horror Heals podcast is produced and presented by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.